This is Section 5, Lecture 1, and in this section we're going to be focusing on the President's power in U.S. foreign policy. We'll begin in this lecture by looking at the formal constitutional powers of the President, but also the informal powers of the President. We'll move on in the next lecture to talk about the limitations on presidential power in U.S. foreign policy. And then finally, in a third lecture, we'll look at the different areas of power, areas of influence, management styles, and things like that. Let's begin by looking at the language of the Constitution. The powers of the President are seen in Article 2 of the Constitution, and foreign policy powers are seen in Section 2. The President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. He may acquire the opinion in writing of the principal officer in each of the executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of their respective offices. What we have there in that first clause is a representation of Commander-in-Chief powers being in charge of the executive branch, particularly the Defense Department, but also the other departments of the executive branch in the second half of the clause, requiring the opinion of the officers of each of the executive departments. Well, in foreign policy, we'll be talking about the Department of State, also the Department of Treasury, Department of Commerce, those that have international ties, other organizations like the CIA, the National Security Agency, so on and so forth, are foreign policy specific departments. Later on, we see here the language, he shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. He shall nominate, and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint ambassadors, ministers, counsels, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States. We see in that language that foreign policy power of making treaties falls to the President, but the acceptance of those treaties has to be shared with the Congress. The appointment of ambassadors, but also the receipt of foreign ambassadors from other countries, is the power formally of the President. This breaks down into several formal constitutional powers of the President I have listed here. First is Commander-in-Chief of the military. The President is in charge of the Defense Department as a branch of the executive, is in charge of conducting war and setting policy regarding our militaries. The President has the formal power of making treaties with 2/3 Senate approval. We will see how the informal powers of the President speak to the treaty-making power. The President has the power to appoint their own cabinet, that is, their own advisors regarding foreign policy. The Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of the Treasury, all of the National Security Council are key and trusted advisors, or at least in theory are key and trusted advisors of the president. Appointing ambassadors, those people who will represent the United States abroad and also represent the president's policy priorities abroad and conduct the diplomacy of the United States. That falls under the formal powers of the president. Receiving ambassadors from other countries is also an aspect of presidential power. Other countries' official representation is directly to the President of the United States, not to other branches of government such as Congress. Outside of those formal powers of the president, we see several informal powers of the president in U.S. foreign policy as well. The Senate has approval of treaties. 2/3 of the Senate is supposed to vote on treaties. However, in recent history, treaties have fallen by the wayside as the formal agreements among the United States and other nations. Primarily, what negotiations lead to with other countries are executive agreements. These are formal agreements negotiated by the executive branch, be it the president directly or by the State Department, with no Senate approval, no Senate ratification. And I have here listed the numbers from each presidential administration. President Reagan, 2,800 executive agreements. The first President Bush, 1,350. President Clinton, a bit over 2,000. President George W. Bush, 274. And we see that in President Obama's first term, 762 executive agreements. One thing worth mentioning is the low number represented by President George W. Bush. It's not that the president put forward treaties to the Senate during that time rather than using his executive agreement power. But we see one of the characteristics in foreign policy of the second President Bush's administration, a more unilateral approach to foreign policy, that is going it alone rather than coming up with formal agreements with other nation states. And so that may account for that low number. Another power of the president that has been applied to U.S. foreign policy is the executive order. These are directives on a particular policy outside of congressional approval. Oftentimes, executive orders are interpretations of standing laws and the priorities that are representative of an administration's policies in carrying out standing laws. So, for example, a very recent executive order that has just been overturned by the Supreme Court had to do with immigration policies of the Obama administration. The Obama administration wanted to allow families of U.S. citizens who may have been here illegally not to be subject to the scrutiny, or at least the full scrutiny, of deportation by United States government officials. Well, this part of this was overturned recently by the Supreme Court just this week. If you are listening to this lecture for the first time, we're talking about June 22nd, 2016. Well, this was an interpretation of a standing set of policies or laws, actually a continuum of earlier presidential decisions and executive orders, standing laws, so on and so forth. And the administration interpreted this in their own way and gave then that task to the executive branch carrying out the law, particularly here Department of Homeland Security and Immigration Services, to act in particular ways. So the executive order isn't a formal power, but it emanates from the formal power of the president in being the head of or in charge of the branches of government falling under the executive branch. Presidential signing statements are another informal power of the president that oftentimes are aligned with standing laws. The president's interpretation of a particular law as he signs it into law are limitations on the implementations of that law, but also instructions to the executive branch on how to implement the law. And so when signing a piece of legislation into law, the administration will put notes on particular aspects of it that they disagree with, that they see as causing constitutional problems, executive branch versus legislative branch, that they see as causing problems with the execution of power and carrying out these laws. And so then the signing statements boil down to, once again, the interpretation and the instructions to the executive branch on carrying out the laws that may not be precisely reflective of the letter of the law. Another informal power of the president is that the president is said to represent a national constituency. The office of the presidency is the only one in our country that is elected by the whole nation. Senators represent individual states. Members of the House of Representatives represent individual constituencies. And so when the president wants to put forward a policy to the nation or claims that they represent the entire nation, it is based on the idea that a majority of the entire nation said that they wanted them to be their representative, rather than a limited majority representing an individual constituency or an individual state. And this gives the president the power to sway members of Congress, public opinion, and hopefully policy to their side, claiming that it was the entire nation that judged them fit to be in office, or at least a majority of the entire nation. Going along with the idea of the national constituency is the idea of the bully pulpit. President Theodore Roosevelt coined this term bully pulpit. This is the idea which refers to the president's ability to sway public opinion, to influence policy based on the amount of attention that the president can receive. The president is nationally elected. They are the single individual that all people can vote for. When we put this into a modern context, we see the president's ability to get media attention, to get television time, to have their speeches covered as much as they want, gives them the power then, or at least the ability, if they so choose to use it, to try to sway public opinion to support their policies. individual senators and individual members of the House of Representatives don't have that level of attention and thus don't have that level of influence in trying to shape public opinion on specific policies. Presidents are also the leaders of their political parties. I have here that they are the de facto leaders of their political parties, not officially, but the president, being the highest ranking member or elected official of their political party, thus has that leadership role. And this can be very influential for the power of the president if the president's political party is also the political party that holds the majority in the House and the Senate, for example. And so the president's leadership, their policies, are much more likely to be passed if their political party also holds the Congress. This can be a limitation on the power of the president, however, too, if the Congress is of a different political party than the presidency. But if they are of a similar political party, the Senate, the House of Representatives will more than likely take a backseat to the president's policy priorities in foreign policy. Another informal power of the president is that the president is always there. And this is what this terminology, perpetual session, is a reference to. Congress has limited sessions. They are in Washington only part of the year, part of the time. They're only in session in Congress a few days a week, and then they have long stretches of recess. The president is always in Washington, is always in the White House, is always in contact with his advisors in the State Department, the Defense Department, and others dealing with U.S. foreign policy. And so because the president is always on the job, this is going to give them a much greater influence in the decisions that are going to be made, the policies that are going to have priority placed upon them, and also in influencing the public opinion of the nation state. This goes along with this final point. Another informal power of the president is that they have more information on foreign policy. Because the president is the leader of the executive branch, and it is the executive branch that is dealing with foreign policy, the State Department, the CIA, the National Security Agency, the Defense Department, so on and so forth. And these people directly advise the president. This means that the president, in making their decisions and in trying to shape policy, has a greater level of information than Congress does. Oftentimes, it is Congress's power to oversee these executive branch organizations, but it is limited because the Congress isn't in session all the time. They're not constantly having advisory sessions and oversight meetings regarding the administration and its bureaucracies. So in all these ways, you have informal powers of the president that are oftentimes extensions of those formal powers, and in some ways more influential than those formal powers that we see in the Constitution.